Alrighty, good evening, everybody. How are we this fine day? Want to go over a few things that have occurred recently in the news, and they stem largely from the culmination of this impeachment trial over the weekend, which you may or may not have been following. It seems like not very many people actually did follow the impeachment trial, which is itself quite telling. It concluded notably on a Saturday afternoon, which is generally not the time that you'd expect many people to be tuning in to legislative proceedings. But nonetheless, there were some interesting facets that I think are worth underscoring. So, number one, the impeachment trial, when the House impeachment managers, the Democrats from the House decided to motion to bring forth witnesses. And that hadn't been expected. Apparently, Chuck Schumer, the majority leader, had not been apprised as to that being the plan. So the Democratic caucus was caught off guard by that request. But the request seemed to make sense to the naked eye because the thrust of the entire impeachment case, the prosecutorial argument, was that what Trump was alleged to have done constituted the gravest ever affront by a president to the Constitution, to the Republic, in history since the founding of the country, 1776. Trump's, quote, incitement of insurrection was the gravest violation in the entire history of the country. So you'd think, given that, if those are the stakes that you're claiming existed, you think what you might want to do is establish a comprehensive factual record of the offense so that it could be adjudicated by the jurors. And ideally, per the defense, the impeachment managers, you can then obtain a conviction. You could then obtain a vote to disqualify Trump from ever holding federal office again. But they didn't then want to even pursue witnesses. So they all of a sudden had a change of heart Saturday morning to subpoena witnesses or to obtain testimony from this woman, Jamie Herrera Butler, who's a Republican member of Congress from Washington, who put out a statement saying that she recounting the details of his phone call with Trump on the afternoon of the quote insurrection. And that account was supposed to be especially damning of Trump because Trump wasn't offering to send in the necessary resources to quell the mob. So the idea was they were going to subpoena Jamie Herrera Butler to relay this account. But even that seemed like it probably wouldn't have sufficed because you still had missing testimony from a number of key players who were named in the impeachment article. There was only one article. Sorry, I guess you got distracted by a comment. There was only one impeachment article, and some of the key players who were named in the article as integral to the whole case were never heard from. Their experiences or their evidence was never entered into the documentary record. For instance, Mike Pence, who the Democrats and the handful of Republicans who sought to impeach Trump or at least claiming that they were doing it on behalf of. It was on behalf of Mike Pence because this raving mob was chanting "Hang Mike Pence," and they were going to try to murder him. And Trump encouraged it and didn't do anything to stop it, which therefore put his own vice president in mortal jeopardy. But we never heard from Mike Pence. We never got a firsthand account of Mike Pence's frame of mind. Did Mike Pence perceive himself as at risk of being murdered? Did Mike Pence seek to effect in the media? But we don't have firsthand evidentiary records related to it. And that could have been achieved theoretically by going through the process of subpoenaing witnesses, which you do in a criminal trial. Granted, impeachment, the court of impeachment is not synonymous with a criminal trial, but some of the principles could apply. And on top of that, the Democrats cried bloody murder during the previous impeachment trial of Trump because the Senate, which was then controlled by Mitch McConnell, did not agree to call witnesses, including John Bolton, who at that point, if you recall, I mean, these details get lost in the haze because they seem so incredibly significant, or at least they're presented as such at the time, but then they kind of just fade away into nothingness. But Democrats screamed bloody murder. They were beside themselves that the Senate Republicans were not permitting the calling of witnesses, namely at that time Bolton, to testify as to Trump's conduct. But now the tables were turned. We have this unprecedented situation where a president is impeached for a second time. We're having a second impeachment trial in the Senate. And guess what? In the interim, Democrats came to control the Senate. They won the two special elections in Georgia. Chuck Schumer was now the majority leader, not McConnell. And therefore, Democrats they had control over how this trial, for the most part, was run. And so they could have called witnesses. Yeah, it could have taken some time. But this idea that it was unacceptable for the trial to run a little longer than they might have liked. What's being prosecuted, what's being alleged of Trump is the worst possible offense that any president has ever committed. Because if what Trump really did was the worst offense that any president has ever committed, then you should want the most comprehensive possible record substantiating the allegations against him. You should want that entered into the public record for posterity, number one. But number two, it could then furnish a case that would be most persuadable to the jurors. But they said no. Chris Coons, Democratic senator from Delaware, who's a key Biden ally, he went over reportedly to the House Democratic impeachment managers and said, no, let's get this wrapped up today, meaning Saturday, because the senators want to get home for Valentine's Day. That was his explanation for why the process couldn't be any more protracted, because they needed to get home and celebrate Valentine's Day. Really? A Hallmark holiday took precedent over fully fleshing out this case of incitement of insurrection by a president against the government over which he presides, which was the gravest violation. I mean, they kept quoting Liz Cheney over and over again, who did vote to impeach Trump, one of 10 Republicans in the House. And her explanation, her rationale for that was that it was her belief that Trump did commit the gravest possible betrayal that any president has ever committed in his incitement, allegedly, of the insurrection. So in light of that, I mean, if that's what you genuinely believe, if that is your true guiding motivation, you should want hugely robust evidence so that it's unambiguous, it's indisputable that the president guilty of such a grave, interesting, because it's as has happened so often with Democrats throughout the Trump era. Their rhetoric is incredibly extreme, incredibly dramatic. Had all the talk of treason and foreign collusion conspiracies and fascist dictatorship and end of democracy and on and on and on. And the final iteration of it, at least in the Trump presidency, was this incitement of insurrection claim. And yet they don't even want to go through the motions or go through the process of compiling a comprehensive evidentiary record. And if they don't want to do that, it has to cause you to question the sincerity of their claims as to the supposed gravity of the offense. Many of them, I'm sure, probably do sincerely believe on some level that what Trump did was really bad. I mean, I think that Trump's conduct around the post-election period was disreputable, no doubt. But then it all gets morphed into this one impeachment article, which alleges incitement of insurrection. And the term insurrection is loaded with all kinds of baggage that you really can't justify. When I say baggage, I mean political baggage, ideological baggage, baggage in terms of what prescriptive action is called for to quell the supposed insurrection. And so that muddies the case in a way that you got to question whether they do genuinely believe to the letter in what was being alleged against Trump, or if there's something politically opportunistic at play. Now, there's always going to be something political, fundamentally true, but repeated too often, that it's a political process, right? It's not a straightforwardly criminal or civil enterprise as you would have elsewhere in the judicial system. But what would be a possible explanation for why the Democrats just wanted to kind of get the trial over with, not go through the process of calling witnesses and litigating subpoenas and everything else that you'd think that they would do if they were genuine in their belief of the severity of this offense? Well, I think it's pretty clear that they perceive political utility in having Trump on the scene as this looming threat that they can position themselves against even in his post-presidency. Because Trump may attempt to run again in the future, may not. Either way, it's still enough of a live threat that Democrats can kind of marshal their political case in opposition to him. And that threat would have been negated. It would have been avoided if what they said that they wanted to get done in the impeachment trial actually got done. If they actually did succeed in convicting him, if they actually did succeed in disqualifying him for obtaining further office. So them not going through the whole extended trial process achieves what they wanted to achieve, which is that Trump was impeached a second time. He was voted to not convicted, but 57 senators did vote to convict him, including 7 Republicans, which is more than I personally expected. So they did get a fair amount of Republicans, but 10 fewer than would have been required to convict him. Exile or semi-retirement in West Palm Beach, but still enough on the scene that they can continue to routinely pointing at him as evidence of how compromised the Republican Party is, how dangerous they are, how they coddle and harbor extremists, how they're unwilling to hold to account those who engage in insurrectionist activity. I mean, Jamie Raskin, who is the head impeachment manager for the Democrats, invoked all kinds of melodramatic, faux patriotic rhetoric in bolstering his case. And that was one of the main problems with the Democrats' case. And it was one of the main problems with their rhetorical posture toward Trump all throughout the presidency, which is that they are not the natural party of this kind of jingoistic rhetoric. Meaning, if you are a hardcore American nationalist of some kind, or that's your inclination, you're probably not going to be culturally in line with the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party thought that they could kind of appropriate this rhetoric of nationalism and patriotism against Trump by calling him a traitor, calling him a stooge of a foreign adversary. The list goes on, saying that he was trying to solicit foreign interference, and it culminated with saying he was trying to lead a rebellion against the government. But that rhetoric kind of falls flat because those factions of the populace which will be most inclined to react to that style of rhetoric are not going to be natural cultural Democrats. And so they gave it one last hurrah with this impeachment trial, and touted by the media in the aftermath of this trial for how wonderful of a job they did, for how compelling of a case they put forward. And yet, what did they do? They lost the trial, right? I mean, the ostensible purpose of a trial, if you leave aside some ancillary political explanation for why it is that they think they succeeded, but the ostensible purpose of a trial is to obtain a conviction, right? And they did not. In fact, they obtained an acquittal. So now Trump has 2 acquittals on his record, and he's still entitled legally to run for president again, should he so please. And that's great for Democrats because they don't really want, it's not the most convenient political position for them to be in, to be running entirely on a positive agenda. Instead, it would be preferable for them to have, a positive legislative agenda, but also in tandem with that, be constantly hyping and pointing at the alleged threat of ascendant fascism that requires conformity and compliance with their agenda. So even if you're not, an enthusiastic Biden fan, the idea is you have to remain on the Biden train, lest you enable the rise of this menacing fascist, seditious element as represented by Trump. So it behooves them politically for Trump to still be on the horizon. And that's a potentially cynical explanation for why they didn't go through with the witnesses. They didn't even bother compiling basic factual records as to what happened. I mean, you can't compel Trump to testify because he was the defendant, but you could compel, theoretically, Mike Pence to testify. You could have compelled some of the leadership in the Capitol Police to testify. You could have Tommy Tuberville, who supposedly got a phone call from Trump. There are a whole bunch of people that they could have called to testify that would have assisted in furnishing the case that they said they wanted to furnish, that they chose not to. So it's then logical, or then it's then necessary, I would say, to attempt to divine what their other motivations might have been as to why this outcome is fortuitous for them, meaning having Trump in semi-retirement, censored, in exile, etc., but still on the political scene, but out of power. And so that's the outcome that they got. So I think, the cynical explanation usually is among the more viable ones when you're talking about this kind of stuff. Now, why is it that the Democrats and the media and some Republicans, why are they so tethered to this term insurrection? Ron Johnson, I saw, gave an interview. He's a senator from Wisconsin. He gave an interview to a local radio show, and he raised doubts as to whether what occurred was, in fact, a, quote, armed insurrection, which had been alleged in the impeachment trial by one of the Democratic managers, David Cicilline of Rhode Island. And, blue check media Twitter was aghast that Ron Johnson could have even dared to suggest such a thing, that maybe the term insurrection was not exactly apt to describe what occurred at the Capitol on January 6th. But think about it. Armed insurrection. So if something is an armed insurrection, wouldn't you expect some of the insurrectionists to at some point brandish, arms? Wouldn't you expect them to possibly even discharge those arms in pursuit of their insurrectionist objectives? That seems reasonable, but that never happened. In fact, we never got a full account. This was another one of the missing pieces of evidence. We never heard a shot. The only shot, in fact, that we know was fired on January 6th at the Capitol was a Capitol police officer shooting Ashley Babbitt, the Trump supporting woman, at near point blank range in the throat and killing her. That's the one shot we know was definitely fired. But other than that, we have no idea or no reason to believe that anybody in the pro-Trump mob ever fired a shot. So to call that an armed insurrection, that's got to make you scratch your head a bit. So why are they so tethered to this term? Why is insurrection being what's cited over and over again? Why did they charge Trump in the impeachment article with inciting insurrection when they could have charged him with a whole host of other things? You know, dereliction of duty, among other possible offenses. Well, because if you go with what the previous implication of the term insurrection was before January 6th, what the term connotes is that an insurrection is kind of a long-term thing. It's ongoing. The insurrectionists are extremely ideologically hardened and committed to their cause and willing to make a personal sacrifice to achieve their goals. Right? So if you're saying an insurrection is what Trump incited, then that insurrection didn't end on January 6th, even though the mob was quickly dispersed, even though they kind of, in an orderly fashion, exited from, for example, the Senate chamber and just walked away. The insurrection is potentially perpetual, ongoing, indefinite. And what does an insurrection necessitate in order to squash? Well, some pretty harsh state action. Corporate actions like the censorship we saw in the immediate aftermath. That's the utility of this term insurrection. It's to keep the level of putative threat very high, which therefore imbues what people who say they want to counter this threat, it imbues them with extra authority, extra moral purchase to demand whatever it is that they want to demand, whether it's curtailment of civil liberties, whether it's tighter and tighter regulation of the internet, whether it's continuous militarization of Washington, D.C. As far as I know, there are still barbed wires. I'm not in D.C., so I haven't seen it firsthand, but as far as I know, there are still barbed wire fences surrounding the Capitol as of today. The trial ended on Saturday. The excuse for keeping the militarized perimeter in D.C. supposedly keeping it beyond the inauguration was supposedly that there could be some threat of violence in relation to the impeachment trial. Well, the impeachment trial is over. There was no violence, no potentially even outburst of violence that anybody could detect. And yet they still have that militarized perimeter. So, if there's an insurrection underway, that gives you a great reason. That gives you a pretty convenient reason to keep that fencing up, no matter how garish it is, and no matter how much it and other militarization components cost the taxpayers. It's $500 million, meaning it was $500 million in taxpayer money was spent on these various security and militarization initiatives post January 6th, and that was a lowball estimate per the Washington Post last week. Once we get the final bill, it's always going to be much higher than was initially projected. And so that's why they've kind of jettisoned the term coup, because coup implies if the coup fails, then the coup is over, right? So the coup you could just move on from. Insurrection has this fuzzy meaning that even if you have this one outbreak of insurrectionist activity, it then means that it suggests that the insurrection could be ongoing and could require this perpetual need to counteract it. So bear that in mind when you see that term constantly being bandied about, and bear it in mind when you now see, as was announced today, that the House of Representatives, presumably in tandem with the Senate, is now going to be launching a 9/11 type commission. This is what Nancy Pelosi said, to investigate everything surrounding the Capitol. Now, could you argue that some investigation is justified? Sure, but if it's a 9/11 type commission, what's that going to do? It means it's going to drag out on and on and on. And it means that this whole specter of insurrection is going to be firmly implanted in the public consciousness. And there's some political benefits that redound from that to Democrats. And also some Republicans who want to banish or purge Trump. I mean, Mitch McConnell, even though he voted to acquit Trump in the trial on, I think, a pretty unpersuasive constitutional argument, then proceeded to go on and viciously denounce Trump in a floor speech, condemning him in the starkest possible terms for his conduct after the election, which means that there's no chance, seemingly. I mean, who knows what could happen in the future, but that seemingly signaled Trump. So if Trump does want to ever run again, McConnell is going to be a definite obstacle. But this vague notion of indefinitely existent insurrection benefits a variety of actors within the political system, and that's why they're so obsessed with it. And that's just something to be mindful of as you see this rhetoric persist. And it's going to continue now, because we're going to have months and months and months, maybe years, of further investigations in the context of this 9/11 style commission. Because if you look at the actual 9/11 commission from 2002 to 2004, that took almost 2 years. And so, presumably this investigation isn't quite as complex, but then again, who knows? Don't put it past them to blunder their way into a very protracted, quote, investigation, because again, they derive a benefit from keeping it front and center in the public mind. So I had a Medium piece that I did a few days ago that kind of gets into one of the rhetorical attacks. It's linked in the description box that the Democrats, the Democratic House managers, use to make their case, which is that they were demanding, led by Raskin, the lead manager, they were demanding that the public sympathize with the politicians. Or in other words, they were arguing that this action by Trump, incitement of insurrection, was so grave, so serious, so despicable, because it put supposedly into jeopardy the well-being and safety of elected officials. That's what group therapy sessions on the floor of the House of Representatives, because it wasn't so much that what Trump did by their lights was an affront to the country. It was that it was an affront to them, the elected officials, and then they tried to transfer that aggrievement onto the rest of the country. But guess what? The rest of the country doesn't appear to care all that much. It's not like this impeachment trial was must-see TV, or that it was riveting, or that it really broke out into the general population as something that everybody needed to be keenly attuned to. And so their argument didn't really hold up. But that's why this impeachment was very interesting, because it was all about the congressmen and women themselves having been wronged. So it wasn't so much that Trump violated the public trust vis-a-vis the country at large. It was that they wronged them. And that's why there was so much narcissistic, emotional effusion related to this incident by the members of Congress themselves. And, AOC did it in her own form with her tale of trauma. And so did Jamie Raskin by trying to weave a narrative where he's saying that he invoked the death of his son just a few weeks ago to underscore the horror of what he says he experienced at the Capitol. Now, of course, losing a son to suicide in this case is a tragedy, but it doesn't have obvious relevance to what occurred at the Capitol. It's all about using the most emotionally evocative rhetoric you can. Turmoil is your turmoil, meaning the public's, and therefore you have to open your heart to us, which is a bizarre inversion of how politicians normally communicate with the public, because Bill Clinton back in the 90s was well known for saying, "I feel your pain." That was something he famously or infamously said. And now we've kind of shifted where it's politicians demanding that the general public feel their pain. And it's kind of strange. So I did write an article on that trend, and it's linked to in the description box. Alrighty, I'm going to go through a couple of chats here. Thank you for all my super chat contributors, as always. Sparky says Mike Pence is a pawn of the establishment. Okay, then why did Trump pick him? If you're making that out to be some kind of pro-Trump point, okay, perhaps, but what does that say about Trump? Jimmy Fleenor says it's clear why establishment Dems hate Tulsi, but why is it that the ostensibly anti-establishment online left hates her? That's a big subject. I think that they view her as an imposter of some kind. I think they view her as somebody who is a Trojan horse for reactionaries. That's what I recall from the primary campaign. And I think the underlying issue is that she doesn't affirm the premises of the culture war that much of the online left wants to constantly be waging. Just kind of because it's recreation to them. I mean, they love having these nonstop, drawn out culture war battles that never amount to anything of real consequence, but amuses them, and keeps is of a mindset where she doesn't really give credence to that. So I think that's a reason. But there are a host of reasons for that. Estev, what are your thoughts on nearly half of Republicans in a poll saying they would leave the party to join a pro-Trump party? I find that to be a little. I doubt that Trump has the organizational wherewithal or the concentration or discipline to actually form a third party. Especially because he has enough of a grip on the Republican Party, I would think, to render that unnecessary. But it shows that, I haven't seen that particular poll, but assuming it's roughly accurate, it shows that the allegiance for many Republicans is far more to Trump than to the Republican brand per se, which is why they were willing to follow him for, any kind of ideological heresy he would want to commit, whether it's in foreign policy or economic policy. Was all about his personal attachment. You could, if you want to be uncharitable, call it a cult of personality. And it, is a reason why it shows that for a lot of the party, the Republican brand is still sort of in disrepute. And it was only because Trump was their standard bearer that they became nominal or notional Republicans. But that might not persist for very long. I mean, we have to see how Trump is able to, if he's able to kind of keep up a public profile in his post-presidency. We haven't heard a lot from him. I mean, I think it probably does matter a lot that he was banned from Twitter. Zana Rosa Smith says, your Twitter is so good. Thank you. Well, thank you. for reporting. Well, thank you for that. I think I recently have discovered Tim Dillon, and I find him very entertaining and hilarious. So I'm humbled to have received a shout out. All right, that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll do it again soon. So, as always, stay safe and stay cool.